Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the All Words Are Free podcast. So, this episode is going to be a little different. It's a little bit more zoomed in, a little bit more niche, and we're going to propose a question, a moral dilemma, perhaps. If you could impart a death tag or a tag of death onto someone, an instant death button, if you will, who would you assign it to? Do multiple people come to mind? Would you even participate? In this conceptual scenario, there are a lot of questions about morality, about taking revenge, about bias, and we're going to look into that today and have a little bit of a conversation. Before we start, right below, before we go into any of this, who would you assign it to and why? Or why would you not? In this episode, we're going to delve into this idea, this concept of the death tag, and questioning our ability to readily deposit judgment and grief onto those we don't know in reality. The general moral is obviously not everyone goes around actually actively killing people, but the flippant things of when people say, oh, I could just kill them or anything. Things are jokes, things are odd phrases, but when people become very angry at people either online or in real life, they see a particular public figure who they profess to hate. Let's see whether you would actually assign the death tag to these people or not, if it was an actual thing and if there were actual repercussions. So the inspiration for this idea came from a video essay by Khadija Bow, in which they talked about Schadenfreude. So Schadenfreude is a German term which literally means shame, joy, but essentially encapsulates the spark of joy one may get from considering the destruction of others. Now, of course, this death tag concept is on the extreme end, but Schadenfreude can cover things like somebody falls over and you get a little chuckle out of it, or somebody does badly on an exam and I get a little chuckle out of that. Or Bow also goes on to talk about Jung's shadow self. So the shadow self and the concept of the shadow self is where we feel that we are inherently good. Humans just do tend to feel that they are inherently good in what they do, and they see themselves and their morals and their beliefs as the best, per se, because ultimately they are what you live by. Now, the shadow self are the parts that we may not wish to admit, the darkness that exists within all of us. We tend to focus on our own goodness, and there can be a superiority complex here. Even subconsciously, people aren't necessarily willingly going around saying that they are better than other people, but we focus on our own goodness while comparing to the badness, per se, of others. Now, coming back to the death tag and this idea, this extreme end of Schadenfreude, from getting joy or perhaps some sort of moral justice from assignment of death onto someone. Now, this obviously comes into the question of the death penalty as well. So in this episode, it's going to be much more theoretical, but I just thought I would raise this because obviously the death penalty is preserved for more extreme crimes, and this idea of equal retribution and whether that's fair. I personally don't agree with the death penalty, but we're not going to actually be talking about that today. We're just going to be focusing on this sort of concept. But there's this common scenario where that people tend to bring up the Hitler as a baby question. Would you go back and kill Hitler as a baby, knowing that what he would go on to do? And this could travel for, any, say, public figure with a heinous reputation. But does the assignment of death onto someone become okay due to the morality or maybe the moral costs that they inflict during their life? Now, obviously, historical figures are one thing, because you quite literally cannot go back and kill them. It is very much a theoretical thing. And in theory, you know, people can say yes, but whether they'd actually do it is another question. This kind of links to the idea of online conflict. People you cannot see, people who, as Bo says, are distant in space and time. So time, things like the Hitler is a baby question, but in space on social media. So it's easy to raise conflict with those who don't have a I've literally just said that. In a Substack article, Astrid Mello says that we've allowed social media to tell us how we should feel. And this is true. I think that a lot of things on social media are highly biased, and by the algorithms, they continue to feed back to us our own ideas. And so this gradually over time shuts out any alternative viewpoints, and this occurs on very subtle and much more overt levels, from, you know, getting advertisements on social media or on websites to the things that pop up at the top on Google. And this gets us in a little black hole of our own beliefs and thoughts, our own likes, our own dislikes, and it does exclude other viewpoints. Now, obviously, social media can be quite a hotbed for conflict. So arguing in the comments being a classic one, to high-level things like cancel culture. In the article, Ashley says that we should never vilify people for using their critical thinking skills, even when the results don't align with ours. Now, while referring to critical thought and conversation about things, this can also apply to comments. Now, this is not condoning hate comments, but it is looking at the idea that we should open up our viewpoint and perhaps respond to alternative viewpoints rather than biting back. Khadija mentions this as well. It's this idea of being open to multiple viewpoints and starting conversations. You can disagree with someone, but you can disagree with someone and share your ideas and bounce back and forth, rather than it being I am right and you're wrong, and I'm going to tell you why you're wrong and say and spread that hate, because that isn't how we get anywhere. Humans are stimulated neurologically by strong emotions. And one of these strong emotions can be outrage, which is why things like hate comments and feeling enraged by something they see on social media or just in media in general tends to be such a draw, and that's why it continues and it perpetuates over time. Now, we are able to change this pattern. The aforementioned article talks about how when we recognise this thorn in our thinking, that then allows us to recognise there's a problem and then make a change. But naturally, we will rationalise cruelness or this sort of quite accusatory behaviour towards other people, especially when we believe that it's justified for certain topics or certain groups. And by this sort of morality behind it, this moral outrage, this anger becomes morphed into a positive thing, when in reality it is a form of conflict and therefore it's not building towards anything, it's not adding to anything, it's simply a mode of release per se. And perhaps it's again linking to that shadow self, the idea that it makes one feel superior, it makes one feel better about themselves because they see the other person as bad. They only see their bad qualities and don't see them as a rounded person, and so therefore the outrage is justified. In several cases, and in several cases online, the outrage is often by a bystander on behalf of a victim. So in a lot of cases, murder cases, for example, you're going to have the victim obviously can't speak for themselves. So a lot of people close to them, but generally as well, because of social media, the public can rain down on particular case, or say for example somebody who was convicted of a crime, and perpetuate this sort of angered cycle. This obviously feeds into things like true crime, where serial killers, they are put in the limelight while victims are only remembered by their close circle. And so while historically this outrage was a pro-social emotion because it brings people together against a common source, now it depersonalizes things perhaps. And while becoming angered for a general idea is important for change, so against domestic violence, against racism, sexism, ableism, while these are very positive changes and positive ways to build a community, there is a certain point where there's only so much anger you can profess to actually make a change. There needs to be some further level of discussion. Obviously, if the other side won't talk back, then it becomes very difficult, and that continues that cycle of butting heads, per se. But social media, in quote, has created a self-serving method of bolstering your own moral standing as opposed to an authentic desire for justice. So I guess the classic example would be during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, when everyone was putting black screens on their stories. It became less about the movement itself and more of people just professing morality. It's not that these people didn't believe in the cause, absolutely, but it just became a way of showing you were moral more than actually showing you stood for the beliefs of the cause and people going to the protests and making that change. It's about, as Rothschild and Kiefer say in a 2017 paper, it's about appearing virtuous to others. And so, coming back to the point, the death tag. In appearing virtuous to others, are we pulled to assigning the death tag to those we deem true targets or impressive targets that showcase to others our social standing or show us up as morally superior or part of a group who hate this person? Or is it a reaching for community rather than a true expression of who we find distasteful? In a similar essence, the death tag does take focus away from the people who are hurt by, say, for example, somebody's views or somebody's actions, and rather focuses on hurting the agent who caused hurt to others, rather than supporting the victims. So the mainstream news, the article says, is good at inflaming topics, and this therefore sort of funnels moral outrage towards a particular cause. And especially in online networks, moral outrage hinders discourse between groups. And so by a topic becoming inflamed on the media, it pulls it further and further away from a solution. And in this way, would something like a death tag shut down discourse and stemming conversations rather than promoting them? When assigning a death tag onto somebody, it's a very simple and perhaps quick fix in essence. Will the death of someone really solve everything? Would it reverse what they've done or what they've said or how they've influenced the world, especially if they're a public figure? Now, going into more of a scientific side, we're going to look into the neurobiology of this outrage. So, outrage through the release of dopamine is both rewarding and stimulating. It is essentially addictive in this way, dragging us back to the anger more and more in a sort of cycle. And so would something like the death tag become addictive? Would you hit that button once? Would you keep going? How long would you keep going? Would you... This kind of links into the addictive properties of social media, but also the addictive properties of commenting and anger and combating with some random person who you've never met and could as easily be a robot. You know, it's a faceless response. And so because there's no direct harm there or no direct confrontation, it becomes almost thrilling. It's that idea of the sublime that the Romantics talked about. That threat, you're right on the precipice, but it's not quite dangerous enough to really harm you or kill you, really. And it's that elation that's associated with that. Funnily enough, though, anger forces you from a lower emotional state. So in brainwave terms, anger is vibrationally productive. So it does stimulate the brain in that way. But anger is also a contracting feeling. So it limits our consciousness and is therefore unproductive. So it's interesting how anger in scientific terms correlates with its usefulness in general discourse too. Now, the hook of social media, as we've said, is the high of a like or a follow. And this comes under the umbrella of positive reinforcement. So each like we get, we want another, or each follow we get, and we get another, it feels just as good as that first time. And you want to keep that feeling going because it's that moment of pure elation. I mean, you know, everyone's felt it. It's a feeling of validation as well. And so you're going to keep posting because you want those likes. And if you get more likes than somebody else, say you get more likes than your best friend on the same photo or similar photos, it's again that idea of Schadenfreude. Because if you get more, you're thinking subconsciously or consciously, I got more likes than them. That is a lower severity, obviously, compared to death, but the lower severity end of Schadenfreude. You're getting joy from their pain in seeing that you have more likes than them. Now, a lot of people on social media platforms are actually passive in the way that they don't post actively themselves. They just like and comment on other people's posts. And so when you're absent from that, then you receive a boost from people agreeing with your argument or taking someone down. You get a boost from people agreeing with your argument in the comments. And so these people get this similar reinforcement like likes or follows, but by commenting on people's posts. And the more controversial or inflaming perhaps your comment is, the more chance you have of getting seen by more people. All of this action is akin to making mini bets when gambling. And in this way, would we assign the death tag just to get people on our side or for a voyeuristic boost? No, if we assign the death tag to a really, really controversial character, we'd get that moment of loads of people saying, oh yeah, you've done a great thing there. Oh, well done. You've chosen a really good one there. Oh, I didn't think of them. You've chosen a great one. But how long will that feeling last? This links into subjectivity. So if everyone had access to a death tag, it would not just be who we deem bad who die. It would be who everyone deems bad. This includes people like fascists. Who would they target? And so would we end up politically or socially just as evenly spread as before? How many tags does each person get as well? And how willing are people to assign it? Different groups may have different willingnesses. When would it stop? There is, of course, an even larger element of morality, and kind of vaguely mentioned this before, in the flippant killing of those we deem taggable. These are still people, no matter what, and we become so engrossed with the fantasy that the actuality comes second best. Wishing harm on those we deem as immoral, is that still justifiable? If one was face to face with this person, would they kill them just as easily as they would assign something like a death tag? Would you assign that death tag? In an article, Justin Weinberg talks about this question and the idea of wishing versus desiring versus actually acting on these desires. He uses the example of Donald Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis and argues that while it may be morally wrong to wish harm on someone, it is not actively wrong. Ergo, you're not actively, say, poisoning the neighbour who yells loudly at night. You're just thinking, I wish they weren't there. Like Khadijah says, you're not responsible for your first thought, but it is in how you react to this. So your second thought, that you find your true values and can question societally entrenched beliefs. The death tag is an interesting variation on this theme because while you don't do the killing, you are authorising it. And here, while your gut tells you to potentially kill an array of people who pop into your head can go back and question that before hitting send on your decree. As Weinberg states, to talk about desires being right or wrong presumes that they are chosen. This feeds into a lot of things, including entrenched patriarchal, racist, fatphobic, and ableist sentiment. To wish something, or that first thought, that's a fleeting thing. To desire is to long for it, to recall something again and again, and it is a goading to the second thought for the selfish enactment of that initial want. But at a point, does it become all talk and no action? Now let's offer a slightly different scenario. What if you're being threatened, or someone you love is being threatened, if you do not assign your death tag? Now you have added incentive, and now, akin to the moral dilemma problems like the trolley problem, you must decide between the death of one you know and one you don't. Hypothetically, this is easy, but in the actual situation, if the other person was going to die, I don't know if I could do it. There are multiple factors to these sorts of questions, but no matter what one chooses in a moral dilemma, they have committed a moral failure. If you choose to save yourself or your loved one and the other person dies, you're still assigning the death of a human being, even if they are morally inferior to what you deem to be moral. However, as we said at the beginning of the episode, just because you deem something to be moral as the shadow self, there could be masses of people and the majority of people who agree with you, and I myself have my own moral values and therefore am biased towards a particular position if I had to assign a death tag per se. But your morals are your own, and in projecting those onto other people, you automatically see yourself as good and anyone who disagrees with you as lesser. Alternatively, you can decide to not kill somebody who you have never seen, who you are never going to see, and therefore potentially would never see the effects of what you've done, of who you've assigned to kill. However, I don't know whether this makes it any less awful. It doesn't make it any less amoral because there's still a killing behind it. However, it's still a moral failure if you do choose this option because you've saved the other person and then you or your loved one dies. There are different types of moral dilemma. In this case, it is roughly an obligation dilemma in which the subject is obliged in some way to enact a certain way. So maybe the killing of one person for your best friend is okay. But, again, kind of linking to the trolley problem, what if you had to death tag 5, 10 or 20 people in order to save your best friend, your mother, your sister, yourself? The final point here is the possibility of repercussion. This is a huge factor, and if there is no chance of punishment for depositing the death tag, does that make it easier for us to bestow? Would the moral aspect of killing someone be enough to stop us in the face of no real punishment, like prison time? This has been a really interesting little topic to delve into. Looking into the idea of revenge, of morality, of moral outrage. It's been interesting to see the biology, the influence of social media, of the idea of community and the inherent nature of human beings. It's been interesting to kind of flick into all these little different areas and apply them to a kind of rogue topic, a kind of slightly out there thing to have a podcast episode on. But it was really fun to put together and research. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you like this sort of mini kind of theoretical episode with little bits of research and stuff thrown in there, let me know and I will do some more of them. I kind of like this idea of like zooming in and making something a bit more niche. I hope you have a wonderful week and let's keep talking.